In this episode, we look at risk management for product leaders with Dr. David Hilson, author of Taming the Risk Hurricane. Hello, and welcome back to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. This is the live stream for episode 484, and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are accessing this episode recorded and not live, please do remember that this is a video episode. So if you are only getting audio, then please look for the play video episode link in your podcast app or simply visit pm-podcast.com/484. Yeah, so what is this episode going to be about? Risk management has become a standard part of the strategic toolkit. It provides senior leaders with forward-looking radar to scan the future and give an early warning of approaching threats and opportunities. However, even best-in-class organizations, they can falter in the face of extreme risk exposure. Special circumstances demand special responses, and extreme risk exposure needs very careful handling. Routine risk management approaches, they will fall short, but businesses that demonstrate a higher degree of flexibility and resilience, well, they will have a competitive advantage and the ability to thrive where others fail. The causes and consequences of meteorological hurricanes, they do have a parallel in the way that uncontrolled risk exposure can develop in organizations. Both are caused largely by predictable factors, but both are characterized by sustained uncertainty and severe impact once they develop. If we can learn to predict a risk hurricane, well, and prepare for it effectively and survive its effects, then our organization will be well placed to address the challenges of these extreme risk exposures if and when, usually, we are unfortunate enough to face it. And that is the moment when we're going to bring in our guest, David Hilson. Hello, David, and welcome back to the Project Management Podcast. It's been a while.
Cornelius, it has. Yes, it's great to be back with you. I think I was at 444 last time, so nice and easy to remember. But it's great to be on 484. I appreciate that.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Before we jump into your book here, which is Taming the Risk Hurricane, we saw that just on the previous slide there. What can our audience expect to hear us talk about? What will the takeaways be for them here at the end?
Well, the key thing here is that we're going to be using an extended analogy. So we're talking about something which people will have some level of familiarity with, and using that as a vehicle to create insights into the world of risk management. So we will talk a little bit about meteorological storms, hurricanes, but what we really want to talk about is how to manage effectively extreme risk exposure that leads to major business disruption. And that's clearly something which in our world today is increasingly relevant. So it's an analogy. With the analogy, you have to present the kind of the start point, but the purpose is not to learn about the start point. We're not here to learn about the weather. We're going to use the weather storm in order to learn about risk storms and how to prepare for and survive them.
Thank you for that. Okay, so Taming the Risk Hurricane there, the logo overlapping it, obviously. If you have a question for David during this conversation, then please do use the chat, live chat in Facebook and on YouTube. And if the question is on topic, I'll bring it up, and then David and I can answer your question, hopefully. Well, let me start with the obvious question, David. Why did you choose the word hurricane here as the metaphor and in order to get this point across?
Well, as I said, we're using the analogy as our way into creating insight, and I love a good analogy. One of the things, there are two things I think are important when I'm talking about risk management. The first is that I know what I'm talking about, that I have the content right, and the other is that I can communicate it clearly. And very often you'll find that experts in particular areas have their own special language, their own jargon, their own terms, and they will talk about their specialist subject using their specialist language. And I've always given a lot of attention and time to thinking about how best to communicate the message that I want to get across. And I find analogy, comparison with something that people are already familiar with, is a good starting point. So risk hurricane actually is not my term. There was a book called Cultural Calamity by someone called Joseph Mayo, I think it's 2017, which is about cultural challenges within organizations. And he introduces this term, risk hurricane, which he coined around the sorts of different types of challenges in an internal culture within an organization. And I was asked to review Joe's book, and I liked it a lot. And then I said to him, you know, this idea of the risk hurricane, I think we could take it a lot further. Have you thought of developing it? And he said, well, you know, I've moved on to other things, and it's quite interesting, but I don't want to develop it myself. I said, oh, can I take the risk hurricane idea and develop it? And he said, sure, go, you run with it. So I'm very grateful to Joseph Mayo for giving me permission to use the term that he coined. But I think, and he agrees, he's reviewed my book and kindly endorsed it. And so I think you'll see that we've taken the idea a lot further than just the idea of culture. So that's where the idea came from. It came from Joe originally, but also there's the concept of hurricane as being something big, uncontrollable. It kind of swirls around you. It throws everything up in the air. And a lot of people, when you get to extreme risk exposure, it feels like that. It feels like you're in the middle of something which is completely out of control, and all this uncertainty, and your impacts and consequences and all sorts of things are happening. And it's really frightening. If you had seen it coming and prepared for it appropriately, you would have a much better chance of understanding what was about to hit you before it happened, preparing for it before it came, and then surviving afterwards, and maybe even thriving afterwards. So I think it's a very powerful metaphor because we know a lot about natural hurricanes, and so we can use that as the starting point for our analogy in lots of different ways.
Excellent. And before we get really into the book, let's also talk about the audience of the book, because even though this is the project management podcast, the audience is not specifically project managers, right?
That's right. We're talking about corporate crisis here. So I define the risk hurricane as extreme risk exposure that leads to major disruption in business. Now, if you're in a project-related business, then obviously a lot of the disruption that your business might feel when you get extreme risk exposure is in the world of your projects. So this book is written for two primary audiences. That would be business leaders and their risk advisors. So the people who have to make decisions about how to position their organization in order to survive and thrive an oncoming extreme risk exposure event. But also their risk advisors, who are their specialists, who speak in their ear and say, now this is what we should expect, this is the best way to handle it, here's my advice. And very often those two groups of people don't speak the same language, as I said. And so they are the ones who are the primary audience. But I think also project leaders have a huge contribution to make, both in terms of understanding the risk exposure of the business and of making and recommending those kind of strategic decisions that will help to position the organization and its projects in the best possible way.
Mm-hmm. All right. And now let's open up the book. What we have decided to do is this here. You see a slide with a lot of P's on the screen right now. The P's represent the chapter titles from the book, Taming the Risk Hurricane. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each P individually. And it's up to David how much he is going to introduce us to each of these individual P's that are coming our way here. So the first P and also the first chapter is all about preconditions. And I believe you mentioned the preconditions in the introduction here. So what is the first P, the first chapter, preconditions, all about?
Yes, well, risk doesn't arrive out of a clear blue sky, as we might say. Risk doesn't come from nowhere. Risk comes from somewhere. And there are causes of risks which we should be able to understand. And so if the same is true of natural hurricanes, there are a range of different weather meteorological circumstances which give rise to ultimately a full-blown hurricane. And we can see, if we understand what those preconditions are, we can see the hurricane developing out there in the ocean, in the Atlantic. We can spot it coming to us whilst it's still a tropical depression or a tropical storm, whilst it develops in potency, and then maybe it might just diminish and fall away. But if we understand the causes of our hurricane, then we can spot one developing before it actually becomes a full-blown hurricane and hits us, and we have to deal with the consequences directly. So there are three main preconditions of a natural hurricane. So the first is that you have warm water in the ocean. The second is that you have low pressure in the atmosphere over the warm water. And the third is that you have a strong circulating air currents. And when you get the warm water, which creates evaporation, you get moisture coming into the air, and a low pressure, which allows that to develop, and then circulation, and it starts to spin with the Coriolis effect of the atmosphere, then these three things together begin to form something a little more organized, which, if it's not interrupted, if there's still warm water and there's still low pressure and there are still circulating winds, gets stronger and stronger and stronger until it eventually becomes a full-blown hurricane. Now, I think each of those three things has an equivalent in organizations which are susceptible or exposed to extreme risk exposure, which make it more likely that they're going to have an extreme risk exposure event. So warm water, I liken that to the external environment, where there's things can heat up in terms of sources of uncertainty. We talk about VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We might talk about pestle. So you've got political, economic, social, technological, legal, environment, economic forms of uncertainty, lots of different types of uncertainty. And where things are hotting up in these sources of uncertainty, it's one of the preconditions for an extreme risk event. But it needs to be combined with two other things. The second is low pressure in the atmosphere. I liken low pressure to a weak corporate culture, where the culture is not strongly based on values, where people don't understand who we are and what we stand for and how we make decisions and what's important to us. What are our corporate values? And if we have a weak culture and then lots of uncertainty in the environment, we're beginning to see the characteristics where we could become vulnerable to uncertainty in an extreme way. But we need the third factor, which is the circulating winds, which begins to organize these things. And I liken the circulating winds to the rate of change in our environment, both internal and external. And if we bring those three things together, lots of uncertainty in the environment, the warm water, lots of weaknesses in our corporate culture, the low pressure, and then a high rate of change where things are moving very quickly, like the circulating winds of the hurricane, things begin to get organized, and uncertainty begins to form up in a way that it becomes more powerful and more extreme, and we're more exposed to it, and it's more likely to develop into something which could cause significant business disruption. So the preconditions, and we talk about it in the book in a lot more detail, what are the conditions of warm water, of an uncertain environment? Which ones do we look out for? How do you spot them? What are the characteristics of a strong corporate culture and a weak corporate culture, and how do we transform our culture in order to strengthen our culture so we're less vulnerable? And then how do we plot the rate of change around us? And these things are obviously there in that first chapter in terms of the preconditions for a risk hurricane to form.
The next chapter, and you've mentioned the word already, is potency. And does this have to do with how strong the winds are compared to how you know how big the risks will affect our company, how
Yes,
strongly they will
absolutely.
affect it? Yeah.
Yes, we're quite used to the idea that that hurricanes have categories. So if you look at the
Oh yes, of
original
course. Yeah.
definition of a hurricane, so in the Beaufort wind scale, which was developed by a captain in the British Royal Navy hundreds of years ago, actually, he just has, you have a light wind and you have a strong wind and you have a breeze, and then you have a storm, and then an extreme storm, and then you have a hurricane as the top level 12 of the Beaufort wind scale. But he defined a hurricane as something with a wind speed of above 73 miles an hour, or 118 kilometers per hour. And then on the ocean, the wave height is above, in the original definition, above 46 feet, or I think it's 14 meters. The thing is that if you define a hurricane as, let's say, a wind speed of above 73 miles an hour, it could be 74 miles an hour, or it could be 100 miles an hour, or it could be 120. they're all above 73. They're all hurricanes, but they're not equally severe. And so a little bit later on, in fact, it's about 1960 or thereabouts, two meteorologists in the States, Saphir and Simpson, developed the Saphir-Simpson hurricane severity scale, which is saying, well, we're above 73 miles an hour and 46-foot high waves and levels of disruption on the earth, on the land. You know, what kind of effect is there on trees and buildings? Can we be a little bit more precise? And they created the 5 categories that we're used to with natural hurricanes. So you'll hear your weather forecasters, if you listen to the Weather Channel or something equivalent in your country, they'll say, oh, it's a Cat 1 hurricane, a Category 1, it's coming, it's strengthening to Category 3. By the time it lands, we expect it to be a Category 4, and that means this. Now, when we talk about extreme risk exposure, we ought to be able to say, well, what do we mean by extreme? Extreme in terms of what? In terms of the potential for there to be a disruption. What's the probability that our key objectives will be affected, and how big might that effect be? And you'll hear perhaps already a hint of the old risk dimensions of probability and impact. How likely are we to be hit with an impact, and how big will that impact be? So we can create a risk hurricane severity scale like the Saphir-Simpson hurricane severity scale, which is just more detailed. And in fact, in the book, we explore one level beyond even that, where there's a thing called the extended Saphir-Simpson scale, which talks about the effect on buildings, the effect on trees, the effect on infrastructure like power supplies, the effect on animals in the field, and categorizes each of these detailed areas against the 5 categories. And so in the book, we talk about how you might do that for your business, how you understand your key objectives, both for the business and its projects. And you talk about how likely each of those detailed areas are to be affected and how big the effect might be. So you can say, well, look, we're looking at the moment at a Category 2 risk hurricane. If we handle it now, we might be able to kind of cope with that. But what would we do if it developed into a Cat 4?
I can tell that you must have had an enormous amount of fun to take that metaphor and translate it over into the business environment.
Well, it is great fun, and hopefully people can catch that. And the book is small. I mean, look, it's only this
It's
big.
150 pages, yeah.
Exactly. But it's really rich because of the richness of the original metaphor, because we know a huge amount about hurricanes. And risk management is really, really important. As you know, it's the most important thing we can do. And if we have extreme risk management, extreme risk exposure, our standard risk techniques probably won't be strong enough. We do need to think about extreme risk exposure in a different way. And because I know how important that is, then I'm really excited about being able to find a novel way of communicating it. Sorry if I'm
Let
too
us.
excited.
Oh, no. This is actually great. This is actually great. And by the way, I don't know if anybody has noticed, but even though this wasn't coordinated, it looks like we're wearing a very similar kind of shirt, you and I, today.
There we
Anyway,
are.
it's just as an aside there. And the third P, the third chapter, is all about people. Makes sense to bring them in early on. Without people, we probably wouldn't have that many risks.
Well, that's right. But actually, what I'm talking about here is the way that people are affected by the hurricane. And so different people are affected in different ways by a natural hurricane, depending on their distance from the center of the hurricane, from the eye of the storm. And so if you're, 1,000 miles away, you might get a little bit of a breeze and maybe, some trees kind of bend a little bit. If you're right in the eye of the storm, actually things are calm in the eye of the storm until you hit the wall of the storm, where you get the highest level of winds, the highest circulation, the heaviest rain, the deepest floods. All those things are happening just outside the eye. And then the further out from the center you go, the less intense the effect is. And so what I do in the book is talk about the kinds of people who are affected by natural hurricanes, those who are in the eye of the storm, in the path of the eye, those who are just a little bit out on the most dangerous place, the eye wall, and then people a little further out in terms of maybe family and friends, about infrastructure providers. I talk about experts like the meteorologists who help us understand what's going on, about the local authorities who provide emergency measures and evacuation routes and so on. Each of these groups of people for a natural hurricane has an equivalent for a risk hurricane. So we might have, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples, the senior leadership of the organization who are at the center of the organization, they're at the eye of the storm. And you know, in the eye of the storm, things are quite calm. That actually all of the disruption is happening just around them in the eye wall, in perhaps the first level management or the project leadership or the program managers, where things are really disrupted. But in the center, you know, it can be kind of, you're maybe a bit like in your ivory tower and you're thinking, what's going on in my organization at the moment? And things appear to be calm. You can use that calm in two ways. As a senior leader, when you've got lots of disruption in your business around you, you can become complacent and say, well, from my perspective, it seems okay. It's all calm in my boardroom. Or you can use the opportunity to make some cool-headed decisions. And so the eye of the storm is a very privileged place, but it's also a place of great responsibility where the decisions you make there will affect the whole organization. And then, as I say, you've got your first line reports and the people who are in that sort of operational management who are likely to be affected quite significantly. And they need to be protected, they need to be prepared, they need to be resilient. We need to have things in place that will support them before the hurricane hits. And then you've got the little bit further out, maybe you've got friends and relatives, which are a bit like our suppliers or our supply chain, our partners, our contractors or subcontractors who are part of our family, who are concerned about what's happening in the organization, but are less disrupted themselves, but it's still important. And then you've got people like the weather forecasters who are actually your risk experts, the people who understand all the meteorology, all the scientific factors that are involved in getting a hurricane organized and in the way that it behaves. And they're the ones who have to understand the science and then distill it down to some key messages for the general public so they know what to do, and for businesses in the path of the storm. The risk specialists have a very key role as people within the environment of a risk hurricane, of extreme risk exposure, because we're the ones who should be able to understand what's going on. What are the sources of the risk? How do they interact together? Where is it likely to take us? But then we have to translate that into very simple messages, like the weather forecasters do. When you go on the Weather Channel, they don't talk about the number of bars in the depression level. They don't talk about the wind speed in that way. They talk about categories 1 to 5, and they show you a nice picture of the way that the cone of uncertainty is likely to develop. And it's all distilled into simple messages that people can understand and act on. And so important people in the risk hurricane are the risk advisors, the risk experts, who are the ones who can take that message and then understand what's going on and communicate it clearly so people know what to do.
Mhm. And I think you have taken us already here into the next P, which is prediction. I would assume this is where we talk a lot more about weather forecast, right?
Yes, as a starting point, because remember the purpose of the analogy is not to learn about hurricanes, it's to learn how hurricanes can help us understand the risk exposure
Yes.
situation. But one of the key things in terms of prediction is looking at the potential track of the hurricane. And you may well be familiar with this cone of uncertainty that people plot on the weather forecast, where you say, the dot is, or the X is where we are now. And then as we go out, maybe in 12 hours, it could be in this kind of area. And then in 24 hours, it could be
And it
here.
gets wider
And
and wider and wider
exactly,
as, yeah.
the uncertainty increases with time, but you still have a predicted path and a predicted severity. So you can say, it's just off the coast and it's a category 2, but when it lands, we expect it to be 3. It'll strengthen over this particular area to a 4, but by the time we get out here, it should be a 1 again. And so that's part of the prediction, the path and the potency. And there are very well developed analytical techniques that meteorologists use, powerful computer techniques, which they distill down to this simple graphic, which we all understand. So in terms of prediction, this is, as I said, the role of the risk specialists, to use our Monte Carlo simulations, to use our system dynamics models, to use our probability impact modeling and our analytical hierarchy development, all those standard risk techniques, which are specialist to us. You don't have to understand it, but I have to know as your risk advisor, what do these things mean for our organization? And then distill that into a message which is simple enough for busy people, for scared people, for people who have other things to worry about, to understand what's going on and what they should do. So we have a cone of uncertainty for a risk hurricane. We can say we're here now in terms of our risk exposure. If we don't do anything, it's going to take us here and here and here and here, and we could end up over there. Is that where we want to go? And if not, I've given you a predicted path so that now you can make some decisions that will affect the way that that path develops in future. And so we can actually change the path of our risk hurricane in a way that actually we can't really do with a natural hurricane. So the purpose of prediction is to enable us to take appropriate action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I know what's coming next. I know which is the next P. And because of that, I can see a story developing here. Because we have started with the preconditions, we talked about potency, people, and prediction. And all of that really leads nicely into the next P, which is preparedness. Because at that point, you know so much about the risk and the hurricane that's coming your way with the preconditions, the potency, you know who's involved. You have the cone of uncertainty. And now is probably the moment when preparedness comes. Now, is that being prepared, or is that getting ready and preparing yourself, or is it both?
Yes, it's both, absolutely. So you're right, there is a story, and I hope that as people read the book or even just think about it during the course of this discussion, you'll see that there's a very logical process. But you know, risk management is the end of a process. It starts with understanding what's important to us and setting our objectives, and then you identify risks and you analyze risks and you prepare your responses, but the risk doesn't change until you implement the responses. And it's really important that we do something. And so preparedness is understanding what we need to do when the risk hurricane arrives. What can we do beforehand? What can we do when it's here? And then what must we do afterwards? And so we're setting a whole range of different actions, of responses with different timelines in exactly the same way that you would with your natural hurricane. If you know that one's coming your way, if you know that the eye is going to pass directly over your house or over your business, then you have to do a certain set of things. If you know that you're 100 miles away from the center of the storm, you're just going to get some very strong winds. Again, you know what you have to do. And so preparedness is about understanding, first of all, your vulnerabilities. Where could you be affected most if the hurricane comes in the way that it's predicted to? And then secondly, understanding the kinds of actions that you need to take and when you need to take them. What can I do in advance? Pre-positioning of resources, making sure that when the power goes off, I've got a generator. When there's no water, I've got bottled water in my basement, or the equivalent for our organizations, about having built-in contingencies at an appropriate level and making sure that those are in place beforehand. It's no good ordering extra supplies when the uncertainty is hitting and everybody, and of course we've learned this from the pandemic, haven't we? That actually when the supply chain was hit and everybody wanted the same, let's say, computer chips for our cars or for our computers, and suddenly there's a shortage, it's too late to go looking for them. If we'd understood our vulnerability in advance, we would have pre-ordered and been ready. So what do we need to deal with in advance? What is there that we can't actually do until the exposure hits, until we're in those extreme circumstances? And then once the storm has passed and we're in that kind of post-storm cleanup period, what will we need to do and how do we prepare for that now so that immediately the storm's passed, we can start clearing up? So there's short-term immediate actions, there's short-term but when in the event actions, and there's long-term actions, and we need to understand what they are in advance.
Mhm. And the story actually continues because you've already taken us over to the next P. And the next P is not just post event. I had to shorten it, otherwise, it would have broken the nice design of the slide. It's post event responses. So the word responses is actually missing here. Post event responses. Are those the long term actions that you just talked about?
Well, no, some of them are very short term. So if we go back to our natural hurricane and the storm passes through and the trees have blown down and the walls broken down and the water's not on and we've got power cuts, then we have some things we have to do right away. We have to restore the power, we have to get the water back on, we have to rebuild the
Mhm.
walls, we have to get the windows bricked up or boarded up. We have to make sure the roof isn't leaking, immediate things. But then there's some other things which are longer term, where we need to make sure that now we know where our vulnerabilities are, we're not going to be vulnerable next time. And there's a phrase that became popular. Well, actually, it became popular during the pandemic. It was introduced something like 20 years beforehand, and that's the phrase "build back better." Have you heard that phrase?
A
And
couple of
so the
times, yes.
idea, sorry,
A couple of times, yes.
well, just once or twice, yes. So the question is, what will we do after we've been exposed to extreme risk exposure? We've had some disruption. What will we try and do? Will we try and recover back to where we were? Will we try and recover back to something better? Or will we take the opportunity to actually do something completely different and become a different kind of organization with a different way of using our people, of ordering our resources, of positioning our assets so that we are not just meeting the same goals that we had before, but we're taking on the new world post hurricane where things are different. Sometimes the hurricane, we had a storm here in 1987 in England, which was of hurricane strength, and it blew down 6 million trees. There were floods everywhere. Houses were destroyed in the path of the storm. And what did we do? Oh, well, we'll have to put trees back exactly where the trees were, make the same kinds of trees and build the wall to the same. Of course not. We said, well, okay, we've got all this bare land now. We've got weaknesses were exposed, which have led to change. Okay, do we want to just put the same thing back again? Or now what could we do differently? And so you get the idea in resilience of not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. So you bounce forward to something else which is better than what you had before. And in the book, I talk quite a lot about resilience and different approaches to resilience, different models of resilience, and how we can actually make ourselves stronger after the event than we were before. Because now we know where our vulnerabilities are and what happened. Let's never have that happen again. Let's make sure that we are stronger than before. And there is a very interesting section in this chapter, not just about resilience, but about anti-fragility. I don't know if you spotted that little section in chapter 7.
Don't think I did, no.
Okay, so anti-fragility is a very interesting idea, which Nicholas Taleb came up with. You know Taleb of the Black Swan? He was the guy who coined the term Black Swan. In 2012, he wrote a book called Anti-Fragility, which is saying that fragile things break when you stress them. Strong things resist when you stress them. You could imagine theoretically that there was a characteristic called anti-fragility, which didn't break when you stressed it, but became stronger when you stressed it. In fact, the stress was helpful and useful to develop something that wasn't there before. And he had this theory and he wrote a whole book about it, and nobody has ever worked out how to implement it. Well, in this book here, I've begun to say, I think I've got some insights into anti-fragility, where we can not just build back better or bounce forward, but become a different type of organization, which is stronger because of the disruption that we've experienced. And I'm hopeful that this might lead to these ideas of Taleb's, which are 10 years old and nobody knows what to do with. This hurricane analogy might open up some insights that we can begin to become truly anti-fragile people, projects, and organizations.
I'm going to have to go back and take another look.
Well, I hope everybody's going to go back and say, this sounds
Absolutely.
really good. I must read
Yeah.
this. Yes, you
Yeah,
must.
yeah. Now, before we get to the last P here,
I wonder
um,
if people are trying to guess what the P is. Do you think they might
uh,
be?
eh,
I hope they
yeah,
are. What could it
I
possibly
don't
be?
think you can guess because this is the one, and I imagine somebody standing in a bookshop, picking up your book and just looking at the table of contents and going, oh, I can see the first six. I get those. The last one, I wonder what the author meant by that. Right? You're standing in a bookshop, you don't have a chance of asking the author. Well, good news, we have the author here with us. Practicalities. That was the
Yes.
one that when I was just looking at the table of contents, that was the head scratcher. I couldn't really think of it and understand. But the others, yeah. So me being
Uh,
the person in the bookshop, author of the book, what do you mean by
well, that's very
practicalities?
interesting. I'm kind of sad you said that because I would have hoped it was obvious. And what's interesting is that in the table of contents, the practicalities chapter doesn't have much of a description. whereas
Yeah.
all the others have these kind of subtitles. So what do I mean? Well, you know, Cornelius, you know me a little bit, and we've talked over the years quite a lot about risk management. And you'll know that I'm a practitioner, that
Hmm.
I am interested in ideas, as I hope you can tell, and interested in concepts and principles and so on, getting the basic theory right. But why? You need to understand the principles so you can apply them. You need to know what your risks are so you can manage them. You need to understand where your sources of uncertainty are so that you can prepare for them and survive them and thrive. So it's all about action. And at the end of each chapter, where we've talked about preconditions, for example, which would be that external environment of uncertainty, the internal corporate culture, and the rate of change, there's a set of actions which are suggesting, well, how are you going to monitor the environment? Where is your risk radar that you mentioned earlier on? Where is our horizon scanning, looking at all these different sources of uncertainty and seeing how the water is heating up and spotting the hotspots and understanding what that will do? There's an action for horizon scanning. What do we do about our corporate culture? We ought to take an action, which is to do a culture assessment, a culture review, a culture audit, and identify the weak spots in our corporate culture or our project culture, which are going to need strengthening and improving, and then do something about it. And we need to have a way of monitoring the rate of change. And again, having our feelers out in the right places, listening to the right people, talking to the right people, to understand where the changes are coming. So there are actions which fall out of the theory within each chapter. And all that we do in this last chapter 8 is to pull all of those action threads together to say, well, there were some actions about understanding your preconditions. There are some actions about being able to define those different categories of potency of risk exposure for your organization. There are some actions about understanding the effect on different people in your organization. Let's put all of those together into an action plan. And let's just say for you as a business leader, or for you as a project leader, or for you as a risk advisor to these people, what do you need to do now you've read the book? And so that last chapter is in many ways the most important, because you could skip all the rest if you just wanted to know, okay, I understand there are things called risk hurricanes and there's lots of detail. What do I actually have to do? Then that last chapter is your go-to place. It's a call to action to make sure that we do something after having read the book. And, you know, I'd love people to read the book, but I don't really want people to read the book. I want people to survive corporate crisis and to be able to understand and manage their risks effectively. And so we've got to do something as a result of reading the book. And what I want as the author for you to do is embodied in that last chapter.
Excellent, thank you. And obviously, yes, one of the next things that I recommend to people is get the book, read the book. Fascinating read, especially the analogy with the hurricane. Before we get into the closeout and the takeaways, I, I I have a question that dovetails nicely into the practicalities here. More generic questions that I have, not specific for the book here, maybe. Um, in the practicalities overall, either from what you recommend in the book for a risk hurricane, what do you think are the most common mistakes that project managers make when it comes to risk management? One obviously being not reading your books.
Yes, of course, that's what they're there for. Um, well, I think more generally than just project managers, and remember the book is aimed at business leaders, project leaders, and
Yes.
their risk advisors. And I think when we're thinking about hurricanes, the truth is that an actual hurricane is uncontrollable. We can't really influence the weather, at least not yet. Um, and you know, we might like to think that we can, but if a hurricane's coming your way, it's going to hit you. And so we need to understand it and be prepared. But risk is different, because risk, the whole idea of the risk process is you look into the future, you scan the future with your risk radar, you see what's developing out there, and then you can steer your organization or your project appropriately. So you can protect yourself from what might be coming directly to you, or you could move out of the way. Or if it's an opportunity, a big good thing, you move into the way so you can embrace it and capture it. And so we do have the opportunity to change the future. And I think a lot of people think in terms of extreme risk exposure. Well, you know, hey, what can I do? If it's to do with, you know, the post-pandemic reorganization of business, if it's to do with the way that China and Russia are interacting on the geopolitical scale, if it's to do with climate change and what's actually going to happen in terms of of potential changes to our environment. What can I do? I'm just a business leader in this little organization or big organization. I'm just a project manager or project leader. It's all uncontrollable. And then you get that kind of fatalistic view. Well, yes, there's risk out there, but hey, I just got to do my job, keep my head down and hope for the best. No, you can do a huge amount to understand and manage your risks in advance. And you can change the future by making decisions now about your risk exposure and preparing now so that some of those bad things will never happen. Some of those possible good things will definitely happen. And some of the things that may or may not happen in the future now because of your actions can't happen or will happen. And so we're changing the future by what we do now. So although weather may be uncontrollable, risk hurricanes are controllable. We can move our organization out of the way. We can make it less severe before it gets to us. We can actually get ourselves in a position where we can benefit from this extreme risk exposure. So even if we can't change the weather, we can't change our external environment, we could change our corporate culture, although that takes a long time. There are things we can do. So I think one of the biggest mistakes in risk is to think, well, I can't do anything. I'm just a victim of uncertainty. It's not true. There's a huge amount you can do. And the purpose of all of this, my whole career and everything that I'm interested in, is risk management, doing something to change the risk exposure. And that's true even for extreme risk exposure of the sort that we're talking about here with the risk hurricane.
Mhm. And since that's the mistake that we make, are there any particular qualities that you would say are essential in the people facing these kind of risks, risk hurricane type of events? What do you need to have in order to be able to weather that kind of a storm or hurricane in this
Yes,
particular
yes.
example?
Well, there is obviously personal resilience, and we talk about that in the book in that chapter 7 about post-event resilience. And personal resilience, as well as project resilience and organizational resilience, are all important, and societal and national resilience as well. So there is, developing my own internal strength and my own ability to cope with uncertainty and my tolerance for ambiguity, and that kind of mental discipline, mental strength is quite important. So there are some things we can do, but in terms of qualities, I think the number one quality is curiosity. Always ask the second question and then the third question. So yes, I know, well, this is true, but what if it wasn't? And what if it wasn't and we did this? And can we do that, or can we do something else? So I think that willingness to turn the page, look underneath the stone, to look around the corner, to ask somebody else what they see, which I don't see. I think curiosity is a key characteristic. And then the second thing, which I think is really important, is the ability. We talk about a helicopter view, that people who take a 30,000-foot perspective of the organization or of the world, they're up here in the stratosphere. And then you get the kind of the ground level people, who are actually boots on the ground. I think successful risk management needs both. So we need to be having the big picture that says, what am I trying to achieve? Where are the big sources of uncertainty? What can I do about it? And then you get right the way down to the detail and say, so what would that mean for this part of the project, and for this person, and for this part of the solution? And what can I do in detail to address this big issue that I've identified? So the ability to flip your focus or your scope between the big picture and the detailed is really important. And there are some people who naturally just sort of gravitate to the big picture, and they see the big context and the what's out there and where they might be going, who are useless at practicalities. Then there are other people who are really good with all the nuts and bolts. They have no idea why they're doing anything. They're just dealing with the nuts and bolts. The risk person, both in terms of a risk specialist, but also a successful project leader or business leader, needs to be able to switch between those two perspectives, to know why they're doing what they're doing, and then how to do it, and switch between them appropriately.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Um, let's close this out with my usual question here, and that's the takeaways. What would you say are the big takeaways for our audience today? Things that they should start thinking about today, tomorrow, as they get back into
Mm.
business and manage their projects and lead their organizations?
Well, one of the things we're learning from the climate debate, wherever you sit on the climate debate, the evidence is that hurricanes are more frequent and hurricanes are more severe. And that's measurable. We can see the evidence for that in the numbers. A higher number of category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes. We name them with names that go through the letters of the alphabet from A to Z. And sometimes we have to restart again because so many came through. That was never envisaged. So hurricanes are happening more often and more severe. I think the same is true for risk exposure for our businesses and projects. You will be hit with extreme risk exposure at some point. And it's not if, it's when. It's going to happen. And you can make decisions now that will affect your vulnerability, your preparedness, and your ability to survive and thrive afterwards. So it's really important we recognize that this is not some theoretical exercise or some entertaining analogy that, it's a bit of fun in a book somewhere. And I enjoyed it, of course I did. I wrote half of it actually on the beach in Antigua in the Caribbean. And talked to real people in the Caribbean National Hurricane Center about what they were really doing on the ground. So I had some great fun. But there's a serious reason here, because our organizations and our projects are subject to extreme risk exposure. It will be more frequent and more severe. And as professionals, we have to recognize that and do something about it. We can't just be complacent and say, well, these things have always been. No, we must do something. And so I think the big takeaway is to say, let's just get engaged. Let's be curious. Where is the next risk hurricane coming from for my project, for my organization? What must I do in order to be well prepared to protect my vulnerabilities and ready to clear up afterwards and build back better and bounce forward? What can I actually do? And I think if we understand that, it's going to happen, but it's not necessarily a disaster. What we do will affect the future. That's the big takeaway.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here today, David.
Well, I've
As
enjoyed
always,
it. I hope you can tell I've enjoyed it. It's I love talking about these
definitely.
things, and I'll talk about them anytime you invite me, Cornelius.
Wonderful. Well, keep writing books. That's I guess that's the way. That's the way to go. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you also to our audience here for joining us today. Let's see. In closing, once again, the book is called Taming the Risk Hurricane, written by Dr. David Hilson, the Risk Doctor, and the subtitle is Preparing for Major Business Disruption. You can find it in online bookstores, but probably also in your local library or in your local bookstore around the corner. You just have to ask. And please do visit pm-podcast.com for show notes, transcripts, and PDU information. Yes, you can indeed earn 0.75 PDUs for having listened to or watched this particular interview here today. Our email address is info@pm-podcast.com. And finally, we have this meme here with Fry from Futurama, who says, not sure whether to improve internal controls or just accept the risk. And based on what you heard today, the answer is probably, yeah, you ought to be sure, right? Oh, and before we go, let me quote a very important person in the risk management space. His name is Dr. David Hilson. In case you're wondering what is risk, he really summarized it quite well. Risk is uncertainty that matters. Yeah, and with that, thank you once again, and of course, until next time.